I'm Hallie, and we are coming on the air gearing up for what may be the defining moment of the 2024 presidential race. That first face-off between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump. Not just their first debate, but the first time these two will ever meet in person, with new polling showing this race is a virtual dead heat. It is a jump ball. It's basically deadlocked. Pick your cliche, okay, but this race is real close. And 3 in 10 Americans say what happens tonight could help them make a decision on Election Day. Our team of reporters, analysts, and backers of both candidates will break that down live from the site of that debate happening soon down in Philadelphia. But we're starting with our other top story tonight, a potential hurricane barreling toward Louisiana right now. We are just getting that 5 o'clock Eastern update from the National Hurricane Center. And here's the latest. Francine, that storm, still a storm, a tropical storm for now, but expected to get stronger overnight, possibly turning into a hurricane at some point before morning. I want to get to correspondent Jesse Kirsch, who's on the ground in New Orleans, Louisiana. What are the preps like, Jesse? What are people bracing for?
Yeah, so Hallie, we're talking about the possibility of flooding, even tornadoes potentially here in New Orleans. All of this as Francine continues marching toward making U.S. landfall. We're expecting that sometime late tomorrow. Of course, the tracks on these things are always shifting, so we're watching the storm as it develops. It is still a tropical storm right now. Francine has not yet reached hurricane strength, so the winds are not quite at the level of a hurricane yet, but we are expecting that to develop over the next day or so. Here in New Orleans right now, you can hear and see the breeze that we're dealing with. The winds are not that strong. The rain is coming down. It's altered between a trickle, a mist. Right now, we have a pretty steady drizzle coming down, but no heavy rainfall at this time. We caught up with some people earlier today at a sandbagging station. We spoke with a city council member as well as one of the residents who was filling sandbags to protect his family property. Here's part of what we heard earlier today.
We're having the neighbors over for a little hurricane party, just boarding everything up, getting safe, getting all together, and having a good time.
We're just a few days from the 19th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. I think people are just cautious and want to be prepared in whatever way is necessary, and that's why we're having a turnout today.
That Katrina anniversary was at the end of August. To be clear, we are not expecting at this point for Hurricane Francine, when it becomes a hurricane, we are not expecting this storm to reach the strength of Hurricane Katrina, which of course caused so much devastation in this community all those years ago. But it just speaks to the fact that it still lingers in people's minds here in New Orleans, Hallie, as we brace for a good amount of rainfall and potential storm surge damage in this community as well, Hallie.
Jesse Kirsch bracing for all of it over the course of the next 24, 36 hours. Let me bring in Bill Cairns now. So we just got that hurricane update. What's the latest?
Yeah, so we still got some really good news, and we got some news that, still is more concerning for the New Orleans area. So this is where Jesse is located. And all of this rain, by the way, is not even associated with Francine. We are watching just a light shield of rain going there. Now, as far as what the forecast is, this is updated from the Hurricane Center. Still a tropical storm. No one thought it would still be a tropical storm. It is a sucked in dry air off of the coast of Mexico here into the middle of the storm. And that's why it kind of looks like a big donut throughout the day. It hasn't really gotten its act together, and that's fantastic. We don't want it to, because the sooner it does, then it will start developing. Hurricane Center still thinks it'll be a hurricane later on tonight and then strengthening it as it approaches areas of southern Louisiana. We have shifted this a little closer to New Orleans. Now, we're no longer thinking this will likely be a Category 2 or maybe a low-end Category 3. This is most likely going to be a Category 1 hurricane as it moves into southern Louisiana. And with it will come some storm surge issues and other issues like severe weather with tornadoes, obviously some high wind gusts and some minor wind damage, and of course the rainfall and the flash flooding potential. Our computer models, this black line is the new forecast from the Hurricane Center, but notice a couple of them, at least 3 of them, are to the right of that, even closer to New Orleans. So that's what we still have to work out, is just how much of the core, the center of the storm, the worst part of it, will be over New Orleans, or will be heading towards Baton Rouge or somewhere in the middle tomorrow afternoon. We do think this landfall will be approximately 6 to 8 p.m. tomorrow local time in Louisiana. That's why we have have these hurricane warnings here from Baton Rouge, the New Iberia, down to Houma. New Orleans, you're under a tropical storm warning. And here's our latest forecast wind gust, somewhere in the range of 60 to maybe up to 90 miles per hour where that center makes landfall. If it's just away from New Orleans, that would be helpful for all the trees and everything else and the power outages in New Orleans. But that's one of the big things. Someone's going to have a lot of power outages, Hallie. We just don't know yet if it's going to be Baton Rouge, will it be New Orleans, somewhere in between. That's what we'll figure out tomorrow.
Bill Cairns, a lot to watch. Thank you for doing that for us and for being there for us. Really appreciate that. Let's get back to our other top story. Tonight's debate set to happen live in Philadelphia in just a couple of hours, not too long from now. So what is at stake here? I don't have to tell you, right? Tens of millions of people could be watching, and Kamala Harris wants to define herself for voters. At the same time, the vice president wants to make the case against somebody who voters say they know well, former President Trump. For his part, he's the one who wants to take the lead on defining the vice president, but he's got his own challenge, too. Staying on message, staying away from the personal attacks his allies want him to avoid. That's an instinct he's been unable to resist in the past, even as his most recent debate against President Biden showed he can stand back and let an opponent unravel. So let's get you to Philly with Monica Alba. And Monica, let's talk through what you're hearing from sources about strategy for the vice president moving forward tonight. We understand, I know from some of our team members, that sources are saying she is ready. She's been preparing in Pennsylvania for days now. Talk us through it.
Pretty extensively, Hallie, and that is no accident. This is somebody who is approaching this like a prosecutor preparing for trial. She poured over all of the documents, all of the briefing books. She went over all of the game film to see every time Donald Trump has basically appeared on a debate stage. And she's coming out of this, I'm told, feeling like she knows what he will say on any given topic when it comes to what he has said in the past. But she's leaving open the door, of course, for the possibility of those very unscripted moments where there may be some personal attacks. There could be derogatory comments. There could be all of these things that I'm told in these mock debate sessions that she had in Pittsburgh over the last 5 days. They did practice. They went through the scenarios, and they had somebody, a longtime Democratic aide who did the same thing for Hillary Clinton in 2016, Philippe Reines, playing Donald Trump, suit, tie, and all, so that they could actually go through some of these potential exchanges. Now, they say that she is somebody who approaches these things again seriously and is going to be focused on the substance, but they also know there's going to be a lot of attention on the style. Are they going to shake hands? These are two people who've never met before or really had any face-to-face time. So tonight, that will be a new angle to all of this. And then on top of all of that, Hallie, the fact that Americans in polls say that they just still really feel like they need to learn more about Vice President Harris to make up their minds about whether they would support her or not, that is something they are completely aware of and know that she has a high bar for meeting in terms of trying to communicate something new about herself to these voters who could be critical, especially in a Commonwealth like this, but all across the country as she's on stage tonight.
Excuse you, Monica Alba. Bonus points for correctly using the word Commonwealth, so thank you for that as a Pennsylvania native. You talk about voters, that's what matters, right? That is end game. That's like all of it when early voting starts potentially next week, as soon as then, where you are in PA, obviously in November for most. One voter who backed President Biden but now leans towards Mr. Trump is in Arizona, and one of our embeds, Alex Tabbitt, asked him about what he wants to hear from the candidate that you cover. Let me play that.
I feel like she hasn't been challenged enough in a lot of these interviews, where I feel like she's prepared and they don't really push the envelope too much. So we'll see tomorrow.
And if she does get challenged, and if she answers them well, could you potentially, change your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as my concerns get addressed, I'm open to vote for anyone.
You see that in the mayor's poll out just today, right? 70% of voters say they're watching. 30% say it could matter a great deal or a good amount. That's not everybody. That's not even the majority. But in a race where the margins are this tight, it could be a game changer.
And they know that. And they know that there's basically this dichotomy between, okay, voters who see her and say, well, she clearly is somebody who's aligned with President Biden. So does she represent everything that he stood for? But she's also coming out here and saying things like, there's a new way forward, and I'm all about the future. So which is it? They are aware that that is the dynamic in voters' minds that they need to address, and that they need to do that with certain policies where maybe she will break with President Biden a little bit while still praising his leadership overall. But also they know that there are certain things that she's going to going to talk about, well, if I'm elected, here's what I would do differently. And on some of that substance, it's hard to get that across in a 2-minute answer on the debate stage, but that's something she's going to be trying to do as well, I'm told tonight. Hallie.
Monica Alba there on the spin room floor. That is also where we'll find Garrett Haake, who, of course, covers former President Trump, and was just like chit-chatting on the phone today about how he's feeling, how he's doing. You've been talking about it all day. He's feeling, he says, good. I think it would be far bigger news if he says he's feeling terrible, right? But the point is, he knows what is on the table tonight, right? I mean, he understands, I think, somebody who understands television, who understands audiences. Tens of millions of people could be watching, possibly twice as many as who tuned into the RNC.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And look, I mean, Donald Trump's done more of these than any other candidate in history, so he understands the format as well as he understands the stakes. And I think he's eager to get on the stage after what I'm told by sources involved in the prep was a last couple of days in which he actually really did bear down and get serious about prepping. I think in the lead up of the last 2 weeks, that wasn't always the case, but he's a little bit more focused now. He told me that the hardest thing about preparing to debate Kamala Harris is this idea that she's taken some contradictory positions over the last couple of years, and he's not sure essentially which set of positions to prepare for. Now, I can tell you his campaign says the answer to that question is one they're happy to supply. They're going to respond to her as though whatever they think the most liberal or the most out of the mainstream position she has taken in the past, and basically say whatever else she says tonight, that's what her viewpoint is. Now, I separate the campaign and Trump because this is always the challenge with Trump.
Yeah, that's right.
We know what the strategy is. What we don't know is what the execution will be like once the lights turn on and there's a sort of a real live person there at the other lectern ready to go.
Because listen, you are, I think, a Dr. Becky acolyte as well, and something that she often says, two things can be true. And in this instance, two things can be true as it relates to former President Trump and debates. He has done, as you say, a number of debates, and in many of them, he can be prone to being erratic, meandering, lobbing personal insults. We have seen that Donald Trump on the debate stage before, somebody who interrupts, for example. We've also seen the Donald Trump that was on stage in June that essentially looked to the other lectern and let President Biden unravel his own presidential campaign. And I think that gets to what you're talking about here. There's a real question. Which of those candidates is going to be on stage tonight?
Yeah, and I don't think we'll know until it's well underway, Hallie. I mean, the way I always tell this to people is that Donald Trump doesn't change, but he can focus. And he can especially focus when he thinks things are going his way. I've also been told that the tightening of these polls, there was that New York Times poll over the weekend that showed him with a margin of error lead over Kamala Harris, has kind of settled his nerves a little bit. His campaign had long predicted that Harris would have a honeymoon after her convention that would eventually end and things would kind of reset to where they are now. I'm not convinced that Trump always believed that, but I think he does now once again see a race that is very, very close, and I think he feels a little bit more comfortable with the strategy as it exists. But again, the moment he starts to feel that's not necessarily going his way, I think that's when we could see the sort of bad version of Trump that you just described, which his campaign is hoping does not make an appearance on stage here tonight in Philadelphia.
Garrett Haake, both style and substance, obviously on stage, and will be watched very carefully. Garrett, we'll talk to you like 1,000 times through the course of the evening. Thank you very much. Let me bring in Florida Republican Congressman Byron Donalds. Congressman, of course, a friend of the former president's. Thank you very much for being with us. It's good to see you again.
It's good to be with you. You should be here with us, not in New York.
Hey,
I'm upset that you're not here, but it's good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll send that up the food chain. So listen, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to my conversation with my colleague Garrett Haake there, but we were talking about, candidly, the different versions of Donald Trump we have seen on the debate stage. One version who is prone to interrupting, who is prone to insults, who is prone to meandering. Another version who, as we saw in June, has the ability to let an opponent essentially unravel, as we saw with President Biden and his campaign. Which Donald Trump is taking the stage tonight, Congressman?
I believe you're going to see the same Donald Trump we all saw in Atlanta about 2 months ago, excuse me. He's going to come in. He's going to be calm. He's going to set the contrast of his successes versus Kamala Harris's and Joe Biden's failures. And it's apparent for everybody to see. The polling has told everybody what we already knew. They failed on the economy. They failed on inflation. They failed on the border. And they have failed on foreign policy. Those are things that Donald Trump was very successful with when he was president of the United States. I don't think there's going to be any change from his tone and his demeanor and that focus tonight. Same thing that happened in Atlanta a couple months ago. But the key thing in tonight's debate is what's Kamala Harris going to do? The pressure is on her to perform, not Donald Trump. The American people know exactly who he is and what he's going to do. She has to have a knockout performance tonight. I don't believe that's going to happen.
Our team has reported that the former president has gotten more, quote unquote, dialed in recent days after maybe being a little bit nervous, maybe disengaged. I know you talk with him a lot. Have you spoken with him today, recently? What's the vibe check there?
Not talked to him today, but I know that he's been focused on really getting out there and seeing the American people. If you've looked at his schedule, they've ramped up the amount of rallies and events, talking public policy. The economic speech the other day in New York City, you couple that with the fact that he has been talking to the media like he always does, but then also adding more into it. All of the podcast interviews that he has done that last 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour and a half. Meanwhile, contrast that with Kamala Harris. Nobody's seen her really in about 2 weeks. So I think it's important for everybody to understand that this is a campaign and this is a race where Donald Trump knows where he wants the country to be at. He wants America to be great again. He wants to fix our economy and secure our borders. That's the same thing the American people want.
Of course, the vice president was just out in Pittsburgh a couple of days ago. But, Congressman, you mentioned the many interviews, the many discussions that former President Trump has. He came under fire just recently for what critics called his word salad answer on child care, for example. Meandering, rambling, in the words of some critics here. What is he doing in these quote-unquote prep sessions where he's talking policy with Congressman Gates, with former Congressman Tulsi Gabbard, with others? What is he doing in these policy sessions to try to avoid a moment like that on the debate stage?
Well, I think, look, when you're dealing with somebody who has so much experience, not just being commander-in-chief, but also in our economy for the last 60 years in our country, he has a working knowledge of just about every public policy issue anyway. I think these conversations are more about refining those points, which is smart things to do, but he's going to be ready to go. There's no doubt about that. There's the conversations going in and out of these policies, just cleaning up some of that stuff for the debate stage. Every campaign does that. He's doing that as well. But is he like standing in front of a lectern with all the staging?
I know
that
he's
Kamala
not.
Harris
You don't have to tell me that. I know.
He's not doing that.
What about the gender dynamic here? Because he is taking the stage now, as he did with, of course, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, against a woman who is looking to be the first woman in the White House, as there exists a double-digit gender gap right now. How much is that coming into play in the prep and the discussions?
Right. I don't think it's going to come into play that much because at the end of the day, whether you're male or female, whether you're black or white or Hispanic, the border matters to you. The economy matters to you. Those are the things that can be fixed. If you look at Pew Research's poll, I think came out maybe yesterday, the day before, there's a gender gap going the other way. Same gender gap with men who were supporting Donald Trump versus women who were obviously leaning towards supporting Kamala Harris. But like I said, Hallie, this debate, the pressure's on Kamala Harris. She's the one that has to perform. Right now, her support, what is it, 48%, 47% nationwide? But the strength, the durability of that support is an inch deep. That's her problem. Donald Trump doesn't have that problem.
Congressman Byron Donalds. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us from, my hometown of Philly. I appreciate you being there. Thank you. Let's get a sense now. You heard the congressman talk about sort of the numbers, where things are. Who knows the numbers better than this guy? Steve Kornacki. Hi, pal.
Hallie.
State of play. Let's get into it, right? Because we said it at the top of the show. You can pick your cliche, whatever it is. It's close, and that's just the bottom line right now.
Yeah, I mean, look at it here nationally here. This is our running average of all of the major national polls. Harris 47, Trump 45 going into this debate. Now, a couple things. This is down a tick. Going into last weekend, Harris had a 3-point advantage in the average. The most recent national polling, the New York Times poll yesterday had Trump ahead, has brought this thing a little bit closer. This is an improvement for Democrats, certainly, from when Joe Biden was the candidate. He trailed Trump all year. But for Donald Trump, you think back to 2016, 2020, this same point, he was further behind than he is right now. So it's familiar territory for Trump, and it also raises that question. I mean, this was the story of 16. Trump lost the popular vote, found a way in the Electoral College. 2020, Trump really lost the popular vote, nearly found a way.
But that is why the battlegrounds matter. That is why they are so important. And our polling shows that Kamala Harris is doing better than Joe Biden in some of those critical states.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's a continuation. We say she takes the lead nationally. Biden didn't have that. And then, we went one too far there. Look at this. I'm giving away the later stuff. So here we go. This is our running average in the battleground states, 7 core battleground states. And yeah, you do see Harris with small. I mean, it doesn't get any smaller than this. 1/10 of 1 point. Right. I mean, that's it. Razor thin. Trump by a half a point here. One thing to flag on this, though, the one state where it's not that tiny is Wisconsin. Harris 4.3. And you may remember 2020. Of all the swing states, the biggest polling miss was Wisconsin.
Interesting.
2016, too. Overestimated Democratic support both times. Are we seeing that again?
It's all happening. I'm looking at this state here, this Commonwealth, of course, of Pennsylvania. Super, super close. You've got, obviously, the debate there today. You've got J.D. Vance heading there this weekend. You've got Kamala Harris doing another event later in this week as the vice president and her running mate get out there to barnstorm after the debate. It's so critical to this race. Where do things stand there?
Yeah, and I mean, look at it. You could see Harris by 1.5 points in the average. Not a ton of recent polling, but look at it this way. Pennsylvania has 19 electoral votes. You got 16, you got 10, you got 6, you got 15, you got 16, and you got 11. What does that mean? If you're a campaign and you lose Pennsylvania, you got to win at least 2 others to offset it fully. First among equals in the swing states, Pennsylvania.
All right, so what are you watching for tonight?
You were just talking about it, too. You know, Trump in that first one, we saw that sort of laid-back, relatively speaking style. He let Joe Biden, you know, fall apart. Did he maybe learn something from that and say, you know, are we going to see a bit of a different version, or does he come back the way we've known before? And Harris, I'm wondering this, incumbent vice president, it's not quite the same as being an incumbent president, but the last number of incumbent presidents in their first general election debate, you know, we saw this with George W. Bush, with Barack Obama.
Since the 2012 Obama.
Not a good first debate. Is there anything to that with her tonight?
Steve Kornacki, I could sit here for an hour.
Let's do it.
Somebody who I think would be annoyed about that. Steve, thank you. And that is Anthony Scaramucci, who, of course, knows former President Trump well. He is going to be joining us in just a second, right after this break. We've got much more coverage of tonight's debate coming up right after this. We are back now with coverage of that first presidential debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, a debate you will watch live right here on NBC News Now. And we know, based on our team's reporting, that one of the VP's key goals tonight is to get under former President Trump's skin, according to what sources familiar with the preps are telling us. Of course, the question is, how exactly is she going to do that? But her team is bringing in some former officials under Donald Trump's administration to the debate tonight, including Anthony Scaramucci, the White House communications director for a brief period under former President Trump. Mr. Scaramucci, thanks for your time. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be here, Hallie.
We've been talking, of course, we've been talking substance, we've been talking style. Let me start with the style piece of things, because as we just reported, there is a sense that perhaps the vice president may try and provoke former President Trump here to get under his skin a little bit. How does she get that right?
Well, you've got the mics muted tonight, and that was part of the Joe Biden agreement for those 2 debates, and so she's got to abide by those rules. So it may be hard to do that. My guess is she's going to be very focused on policy tonight and doing that comparison analysis. Here's my vision for the future. Here's why my policies are better for Americans. And here's how the country looks alongside of our allies as we go forward in the world. I think that's where she's going to go with this. Will she get under her skin? I predict that she will, because she's a very strong, very powerful woman, and we know that's been a big bother for Mr. Trump in the past.
You are here. I know that former Donald Trump press secretary Stephanie Grisham is in Philadelphia, also spinning on behalf of the Harris campaign. You've got the Cheneys coming out, Liz Cheney saying that both she and her father will be voting, of course, for Vice President Harris. This idea of Republicans who maybe are considered in the never Trump camp, or at least not Trump now camp, are coming out to back Harris. How critical is that for the coalition she's looking to build? And what else does that campaign need to do to put out an olive branch to others like you who may not be doing a bunch of cable and streaming TV?
So it's a good question, and I don't want to overstate my or anybody's importance, but I do think it holds very well for the vice president. So when people say, does it concern you that there are 40 people that once worked for Donald Trump that were in the administration, assistants to the president working alongside him in the West Wing, that don't trust him and don't want him anywhere near the presidency? When you hear somebody like Vice President Pence on the ballot with him twice say, hey, he puts himself above the Constitution, I think that polls very well. And I think what Vice President Harris is looking to do, and she's had success thus far, is to build this very broad-based coalition. So imagine Bernie Sanders, myself, and Dick Cheney voting for the same presidential candidate in 2024.
You, Bernie Sanders, and Dick Cheney walk into a bar. I mean, that's a setup to an unexpected punchline, if you've ever heard one. The other piece of this, of course, is the way that, interestingly, Democrats are now looking to make age an issue. You and I flash back to maybe 3 months ago, right, when it was President Biden there getting ready for his debate against former President Trump, with the majority of voters indicating that they had real concerns about his fitness for office there, in part because of his age. Now you've got Democrats looking to turn that issue onto Donald Trump, who, of course, in his late 70s. You've got the Harris camp, Harris herself, talking about the quote-unquote tired old playbook, et cetera. Talk through that dynamic here and how she effectively makes the case in the face of somebody who may turn to her and say, well, wait a second, you supported President Biden right up till the end.
Well, listen, I mean, it's politics. This is a hard-knuckle process. She's playing hardball. She knows that it bothers him. And so one of the things about getting under his skin, she knows he's self-conscious about being old. She knows that he flubs it a lot on the teleprompters and things like that, and he gets confused as to where he is. I think he was in Pennsylvania. The other night said he was in North Carolina. And so she wants to hammer that home to people. And listen, all is fair in love and politics. And so I don't mind her taking that position. And I think that's one of the ways she can unnerve him.
We talk about some of the substantive issues that will come up. You know, it's going to be the economy that will be front and center as one of the issues here, because so many Americans say it is what is driving them to the polls this election season. You recently said on a podcast with Don Lemon, and I'm quoting you here, nobody is fiscally responsible anymore. There's this new Marist poll out showing that a slim majority of voters think that it's former President Trump who is better equipped to handle the economy. We're seeing the numbers here on screen. How does the vice president turn that around?
Well, I think she's got to get her narrative out there. I think she has a very good record to run on. Inflation is coming down. Wage growth is up over the last 3 years. Remember, we're onshoring manufacturing now as a result of their legislative agenda. We're building microprocessors. Imagine that here in the United States again. And last but not least, she's rebuilding bridges, roads, and tunnels, which is reducing the cost of transit activity in the United States, which is great for the economy and great for businesses. I think one thing we have to point out about spending, we went from George Washington to George W. Bush and had a $7 trillion deficit. In 4 years, Donald Trump created a $7.8 trillion deficit. He's calling for a reduction in tax and Social Security, which is an additional $4.6 trillion over 10 years, Hallie. So he's a very, very dangerous guy with dangerous policies. Of course, he wants to put tariffs, and tariffs are very regressive on poor people.
Not to get into the economic weeds here, and I know I got to let you go, but you talk about deficits. Do you believe that Republicans care about deficits? Because if you look at votes in Congress under former President Trump, I think that's a fair question to ask.
Years ago they did. Today they don't. I think it's dangerous. I think the United States is way more prosperous than people give it credit for. But there will come a time, if we don't deal with it, it will lead to a crisis.
Anthony Scaramucci live for us there in Philly. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you.
Hey, good to be here. Thank you.
Coming up after a break, we're going to take you right back to Philly, talking to a couple of folks who know the candidates about what they've got to do to win over those undecided voters and how the gender gap may factor into all of this. What a gorgeous skyline right there. Could look at that all day. We are back with that live continuing coverage of tonight's critical debate in Philadelphia. And I want to bring in a couple of folks who know these candidates well. That's the Donald Trump 2020 campaign National Press Secretary Hogan Gidley and former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, also, of course, the host with Inside with Jen Psaki on MSNBC. Okay. Let's start with, I think, expectations for tonight, because I'm super curious to hear from both of you. And one thing that struck me, Jen, even just in talking with, for example, Congressman Donalds, one of the surrogates there who's in for the Trump campaign, he said the onus is on Vice President Harris tonight. There is a sense, I think, in the expectation-setting game that everybody plays before debates like these, that it is somewhat asymmetrical, that perhaps the expectations for Harris are higher than the expectations for Donald Trump. I wonder how you see it.
They're all playing this expectations game, right? You hear it from both sides. Look, she is a better debater, I think, historically. So there is that. And she has prepped more. There's no question about that. But he's also just prepped differently. So I think that the expectations game stuff is just normal course of business. It doesn't really matter until the debate actually starts. What is different, though, is she hasn't done a debate at this level in 4 years. They've also never...
Wait a second. She hasn't done a debate at this level as a presidential nominee ever, right?
Or in a debate close to this level, I guess, even in 4 years. They also have never met, as you've talked about before. And that blows my mind. I don't know if it blows your mind. But there is something about the dynamics and the chemistry or lack of chemistry that's an interesting component. So I'm wondering how that will impact her, too. Hey, expectations game setting, it's part of the game. We've both done it. It doesn't matter when the debate starts.
Does it blow your mind? I mean, really, I think there's a question of, like, that first moment. Do they come on stage and shake hands? Like, all of these kinds of questions around this.
I think she should try to shake his hand. Do you think he should try to shake her hand?
Why not? I mean, if they haven't met, you're going up against somebody to have a conversation, talking about your policies for the American people. Why not introduce yourself to one another? In fact, you just point out, it blows my mind, too. They haven't met.
I was going to ask, does it also blow your mind?
It blows my mind. And this entire time in D.C., they've never met. I mean, she's been doing this for, what, 25 years at this point? He was president of the United States. She was a senator. They've
been in
never
the
had a
same
conversation.
He didn't show up to the transition of power, so that was a big opportunity to meet, which she wasn't a part of for a range of reasons.
That's also true.
We talk about this moment to introduce people. I'm sort of fascinated by this statistic of how many people watched the debate in June versus how many people watched the RNC and DNC, right? Because we talk about those conventions being these high-profile primetime moments, and they are. Twice as many people, tens of millions, watched the debate in June. 70-plus million watched the debate in 2020. 80-plus million watched the debate in 2016, right? These are monster numbers. It's not the Super Bowl, but it's in politics about as close as you're going to get. 3 in 10 voters say that they will have this is going to play a good part of their decision-making process when it comes to tonight of how they roll. And 1 in 10, only 1 in 10, say they need to know more about former President Trump. He's kind of baked in the minds of voters. How does he get past that tonight? How does he try to, if he wants to redefine himself or try to define her?
I don't know that he wants to redefine himself. I think what he needs to do is make sure he relies on his record and talks about the record-setting success the American people felt. I think he needs to do a good job of kind of defining her before she can define herself. I think he needs to stay on message. I mean, those are 3 things that if he does those, I think he'll come out at the very least on par with her, if not a clear victory for him on the debate stage.
There's also the gender dynamic, Jen. There's a big gender gap in this race. It's anywhere from about 13 to 14 points, depending on which poll you're looking at. And you look back at the last time that he debated a woman who was seeking to win the White House. And I think people remember that moment when he loomed over former Secretary Clinton.
Leered, yes.
She talked about it in her memoir, that she was extremely uncomfortable, obviously, with that moment and debated whether to tell him to step back, et cetera. That's not going to happen tonight. Both of the candidates have to stay at their microphones. The microphones will be muted. How did the rules of tonight play into what we expect to see on stage?
Well, the microphones being cut off is a big deal. There's a good reason why the Harris campaign wanted them to be left on, because if you look back at that moment from 2020 where Trump kind of lost his mind a little bit, it was because he kept talking. And ultimately, if you're the Harris team, you would love to see that happen. There's not an opportunity for that. It's 2 minutes, right, for your answer, 2 minutes for rebuttal, and then I think 1 minute.
2-2-1.
2-2-1, which means it's less likely people in the room may hear, which there's only the moderators in the room, but you don't know what he's going to say under his breath. People won't hear that. That could have been a moment. That would have been a moment we would have been talking about a couple days from now. It's a lot more controlled, which I think is better for him, not as good for her.
I'm hearing in my ear that we now have brand new sound, I think, Jill, right, from President Biden in just the last couple of minutes here, talking about tonight. And I believe he said he's been in touch with Vice President Harris just today. Let me turn that around and play it for folks here, just coming into us. We're going to listen to it together.
I spoke to the Vice President. She seems calm, cool, and collected. I think she's going to do great. And I'm not going to tell you what advice I gave.
Okay, so he gave her some advice, he says. He's not going to tell us what it is, but that she's feeling calm, cool, and collected. Is there any risk that with all the preparation, Jen, she is maybe, in the words of one source talking to our team, overcooked or over-prepped?
I mean, yeah, the key with prep is you can't let it tie you down, right? You prep so that you can be agile in the moment. That's true in anything. When you're interviewing
I was just thinking my first time on Meet the Press. I was doing all this prep, and I had a colleague say to me, chill.
Just calm down, be in the moment and see what they ask you. And so that's the risk. And we saw a version of that. There were other issues, of course, with that first debate. But one of the issues was that President Biden was trying to spit out all of the numbers and data that he knew. First of all, voters don't vote on numbers and data. They vote on how you connect with them, whether they think you're fighting for them when they're sitting at home. She has to remember it's about pulling heartstrings. It's not about listing data.
But you know what else voters vote on? Hope. with new numbers out today showing that that is the message that they want to see from candidates. How does a candidate like former President Trump, whose campaign has had dark and ominous overtones, try to deliver that message?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people who follow Donald Trump and want him to be president are hopeful that they could go back to being able to afford gas and groceries, for example, that a southern border would be secure, there wouldn't be wars breaking out all over the world. That's the hope he needs to be talking about because his policies are clear. Ironically, this entire debate will be Donald Trump trying to remind people of his record and Kamala Harris trying to make people forget about hers because the way people feel right now are because of Kamala Harris. So it's a really interesting dynamic to watch them because, again, he was president of the United States. He has a record to run on. And this whole hope and vibes thing, I get a lot of people like that. That's fine. Tried to pay for my groceries with hope the other day. Didn't work. Then I tried to pay with vibes. They said, no, we don't take that either. The fact is, people care about the policies that allow them to succeed. Kamala Harris has not offered that. Donald Trump has to talk about that tonight.
So strange, because I just tried to Venmo you some vibes the other day, and it didn't work. I wasn't clear on that. Donald Trump will get the last word tonight. He gets to go last for the closings. I'm going to give you the last word here. Final thoughts to you.
I mean, look, this is a huge night for both of them. It's the last night, maybe, we'll see, but the last night we know of that they will be standing side by side. Debates, they don't necessarily change things forever, but they are a moment to shake things up. So it's not just about what happens tonight. It's about what are the moments that people are still talking about tomorrow and a week from now. And if you're on either of these campaigns, that's what you're thinking about.
Jen, Hogan, great to see both of you. We'll be talking, I know, more this evening. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Coming up, VP Harris, former President Trump, their most memorable moments on past debate stages, national and local next, as Philadelphia and the rest of the country get ready for them to take the stage. You're taking a live look now at that spin room in Philly. We'll be back in just a sec. We are laying out expectations for tonight, right? Vice President Harris, the former prosecutor, set to take on Donald Trump. Donald Trump, kind of a showman based on his years in reality television, and perhaps the two of them hoping to avoid going viral for the wrong reasons, because no matter how much you prep, sometimes it's those meme-worthy moments from debate nights, some of them more emotional, others kind of cringe, that tend to live on in people's minds. Their past debates may give us a signal, a clue, as to their strategies tonight, so we took a look at some of those most critical moments. Watch. Tonight, the first face-off between two candidates with different prep, different styles, and different experience. For Vice President Harris, her first time stepping into this kind of general election spotlight after memorable moments in primary and VP debates.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking.
Harris, no stranger to the stage, from early in her career to her Senate run in 2016, when her opponent awkwardly dabbed.
So there's a clear difference between the candidates in this race. And I think the voters will make that decision.
Allies point to Harris's past as a prosecutor in arguing her experience helps shape sharp arguments.
Whatever the vice president is claiming the administration has done, clearly it hasn't worked.
And Harris drawing on her personal background, like in this key exchange in the 2020 primary with her future boss.
You also worked with them to oppose busing. And you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
But Harris has had to play defense, too, like in another debate that cycle, accused of hypocrisy for shifting to a more progressive position in a crowded primary.
There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana.
For his part, Mr. Trump has more debate experience as a presidential nominee, 6 in all, most recently in June, a showdown that ultimately ended President Biden's presidential run.
We finally beat Medicare.
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death.
Their first ever debate in 2020, notable just as much for what Mr. Trump didn't say when asked if he'd condemn white supremacists.
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by.
Then candidate Trump's first debate against Hillary Clinton in 2016 still holds the record for the most watched ever, 84 million viewers. At later face-offs, the two sparring over foreign policy and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
Mr. Trump memorably looming behind his opponent on stage. At other points, delivering personal attacks.
Such a nasty woman.
And earlier in the Republican primaries, responding to a crass insult about the size of his hands.
Look at those hands. Are they small hands? I guarantee you there's no problem.
Now, tonight, Vice President Harris hoping to make good on past pledges.
I'd wipe the floor with him.
But according to the rules of this debate, it's former President Trump who will get the last word.
We're going to make it great again.
I want to bring in now somebody who was covering, I think, every debate that we showed there, plus many more. And that is, of course, our NBC News chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, who is joining us now from the spin room in a place that we both know and love, Andrea, and that's Philadelphia. Listen, we know that tonight's debate in many ways is a first. I wonder how it feels to you, based on your reporting and your analysis of this moment, compared to other debates that you've covered.
Well, watching your reel, I was getting a little PTSD, actually, going down memory lane. And some of those moments were just so excruciating for the candidates, one or another of them. But I think this one is the most important. There is just nothing that compares to this, Hallie. You've been there. I mean, you have a former president and a current vice president. The current president, just 70-plus days ago, took himself out under huge pressure to do that, an historic decision to give up power voluntarily to his vice president. She has to prove herself. She's only done one interview. And so people don't know who she is, according to the polling. Twice as many people think that Donald Trump would be a change agent than she. She's got to fill in those gaps, do more than a resume, do more than talking about the legacy of Joe Biden, but delicately separate herself and show that she can also be something new and different. Look, she is different. She is a woman. She is much younger, and she is a fresh face to a lot of people who haven't seen her so much. There are opportunities there for her, but she's got to fill in those gaps. She's got to talk about the economy, avoid some pitfalls, and then, of course, he is such an unknown factor. He can be disciplined, but we haven't seen him be that when it comes to a woman candidate. When it comes to females, somehow his response is always, not only unpredictable, but really offensive, as Nikki Haley was saying, and a lot of his own advisors have been telling him. Don't talk about appearance. Don't call them stupid. Talk about policies. Will he do that?
There's also the point. Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the stakes are so high because of the differences, the contrasts between these two candidates, their principles, the way Trump distorts the truth. You have to say it. The bullying that the New York Times pointed out on, memorably today. Yeah. This is a candidate that we have to cover in a different way.
Making the point that even when former President Trump talks policy, when Vice President Harris talks policy, the former president often gets in some sort of personal attack in that conversation. Yeah. Let me ask you about VP Harris, because of the way this cycle unfolded, with President Biden stepping off the ticket and her ending up on the ticket relatively quickly, she was not tested by any primary debates this cycle. She's obviously done 4 previously. Does that help or hurt her this time around?
I think it hurts her, because, she avoided a lot of pitfalls by not getting beaten up in the primaries, as candidates inevitably do. She hasn't made mistakes yet in these last, 70-plus days. But the fact is that she hasn't been tested in the rough and tumble of a campaign. We saw how in 2016, Hillary Clinton did not do well in that test. She really reacted badly on a lot of those other issues and shut down, didn't do interviews, didn't handle the pressure, which was extraordinary pressure, but didn't handle it the way she needed to deal with this unpredictable candidate, Donald Trump.
And for his part,
what's going to happen in this shortened campaign?
Yeah. You talked about how his history, and we've showed it there, saying inflammatory things, of course, famously or infamously, memorably calling Hillary Clinton a nasty woman on the debate stage here. There is also the sense, as you heard from some people close to him, even in the course of the last 49 minutes here, that they would like him to focus on substance, on policy, on issues like the economy and immigration, where he polls better than her by a slim margin here. Talk me through what you'll be watching for on that front tonight.
Well, what he did the last time with Joe Biden, no matter what he was asked, pretty much he answered about immigration. And so does he do that? Does he avoid the questions? And in this format, will she be able to come back at him? She doesn't want to spend all of her time fact-checking him, because that's going down a rabbit hole. Will the moderators break in and do some of that themselves? Will they do any fact-checking? We're told by ABC that they feel that they have that flexibility. So if it's just a tightly formatted campaign where he gives his positions and she gives hers, then the viewers, the voters they won't learn what they need to learn.
Andrea Mitchell, thank you very much. And isn't that what it all comes down to? Are voters going to learn what they need to learn tonight? Coming up, we're going to try to read the tea leaves on specifically who those voters that both candidates are trying to reach are. As we count down, of course, to debate night in Philly with a live look at the skyline there, just about sunset. You can't see the link, but it's in there. So, this debate happening in the critical battleground Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And you know from that conversation we just showed you with Steve Kornacki a little bit earlier that it is very close in that state. As we're taking a look here at Donald Trump, speaking of Philly, landing there as we speak. This is the former president's plane. So here he is, now arriving on the ground. Vice President Harris is already there. We know that. She's actually been in the state of Pennsylvania for days now. She's been in the western side in Pittsburgh doing some prep. That is where she hunkered down, although she did make a couple of what they call OTRs, these like unexpected campaign stops. She visited a spice shop. She made an appearance. She talked about how she's feeling about this debate, did a radio interview, among other things. Now Donald Trump is also in Philadelphia, just hours away. Just about 3 hours away, I should say, from the start of debate night. So, Pennsylvania, key. Michigan, also key. Our team there, talking with voters in some of these key states. We want to show you that real quick.
I hope that her performance tonight will show that she's the right candidate.
I would actually like to hear Kamala's policies. She hasn't been very clear on anything. It seems like a celebrity campaign so far.
You voted for Trump in the past, but it sounds like Vice President Harris has the ability to win your vote tonight.
Yeah.
Well, that says it all, right? Yeah, an ability to win a vote. Any candidate presumably would want to hear that. Tara Palmieri is joining us now, senior political correspondent over at Puck News. Hey, Chuck Todd is back home in Washington, our NBC News chief political analyst. So as we keep an eye on that, of course, plane as former President Trump lands, we'll see if potentially he says anything. Chuck, you wrote today you're keeping an eye out for which voters the candidates will try to directly address tonight. We got a signal of that back at the Democratic National Convention based on the vice president's speech, the people that she seemed to be aiming at. Talk us through your sense and expectation for tonight and how important that is.
Well, look, I mean, that's frankly, it's a good way to watch the debate. You get an idea of what each candidate's campaign believes is the theory of the case. You'll get it more from the Harris side than you will from Trump. But the question really is, you know, for Harris to win, she's got to figure out how to get 50 to 51% of the vote. We know Donald Trump, his theory of the case is he's got to make 48% a winning number. All right, there is a lot of evidence that suggests he can't get to 50 and he doesn't want, so he's got to make sure she can't get there either. So what do I mean? Who are those voters? Well, that small slice of voters, they're mostly the centrists. They're mostly the former double haters, the people that were unfavorable to both Biden and to Trump. And I think they're skeptical of Harris. And she's got to figure out, she's been trying to appeal to them on tone, not on substance. That, hey, you know, she's trying to do the turn the page messaging, which is sort of, are you exhausted from the Trump era? She's trying to turn him into the incumbent of this political era, even though she's part of the technically the incumbent administration.
Well, right.
But that's the voters she's talking about. And I'm curious, is she going to give them more than just, I'm going to turn the page, right? Is she going to signal, how is she going to virtue signal, I'm not going to be controlled by the progressive left? And that is a question she didn't answer at the convention. And I'll be curious if she answers that tonight.
Tara, let me go to you here. And I got to also correct myself. With the plane we saw land, that was actually J.D. Vance, the former president's running mate, the whisper down the lane, whatever, that's the situation. But just wanted to let folks know there we are still waiting on the former president to land in Philly. You know, a place that is near and dear to my heart, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Wawa, because I talk about Wawa every day of my life. Right. And there's a billboard now, Wawa themed, that the Harris camp debuted in Philly, mocking the former president, mocking his rally crowd sizes. I think another way that the Harris team, and you're seeing it there, Wawa for coffee, wah, wah, they say when people don't show up to a Donald Trump rally. This is a way that the Harris camp was looking to troll the former president. They ran an ad featuring many of his former Trump and some of his former administration officials slamming a second Trump term right in his backyard in West Palm Beach. How do you think that that is going to be a focus tonight, getting under the former president's skin?
Absolutely. I've talked to advisors who are preparing Kamala Harris, and her goal is to make him feel small. In a lot of ways, she doesn't even really want to be debating with him or getting into the mud with him or really jousting with him, but really being a level higher, elevating and speaking directly to the American people. And that means not getting into the fight that he wants to, because what he's going to do is he's going to answer the question quickly and then pivot to hitting her, right? And that'll be an opportunity for her to defend her record and then go after him. And she's going to do the same. I mean, you saw that a lot in the last debate. Trump would hit Biden and Trump would answer the question
and then pivot.
Exactly. So you're going to see that from him and you're going to see that from her. So it could get quite contentious. But she's trying to figure out a way to rise above it and to make him feel small. So that's why she spoke to Hillary Clinton recently and asked for some advice on that. I think it's just Trump is very unpredictable. You know, he's not an easy person to debate. You don't know what you're going to get. And it's quite a spectacle. And it's hard to avoid being a part of the spectacle. So it'll be interesting to see how she's able to handle that. And you really have to be on your toes. I don't think this is going to be easy. And I think when he doesn't get what he wants, he can go to places and drag you into it. So
despite what his aides, advisors, what allies are telling him that they'd like to see him do, I think they all understand Donald Trump's going to do what Donald Trump's going to do, ultimately at the end of the day.
Right. They basically have told me, you know, we can give him advice, he'll take it. There's a 50% chance he takes it.
Yeah, or not, right? It's a total coin flip. Chuck, you know, Tara said something interesting, that one of the things that Kamala Harris wants to do is make Donald Trump look small, if you will. And you and I have talked about this because over the course of the last, I guess, 6 weeks, if my calendar math is correct here, you have seen this more and more, right? Democrats looking to paint him not as this large, looming, ominous threat to democracy as President Biden did, but as somebody who's small and weird, in the words of course, Governor Walz. How much is that going to factor into the debate stage tonight? We heard her allude to this at the convention, calling him unserious. That is a line of attack she has used on previous opponents. I'm thinking back to her Senate race in 2016. How effective do you think that'll be?
Well, it depends on how she does it. If she is the instigator, I think you know, there's that fine line you showed earlier in your program. Some of the debate moments and the Marco Rubio moment, right? When he decided, oh, yeah, I'm going to get down to Trump's level. Well, what happened to Rubio, right? It sort of sullied him, right? It sullied him, and it still kept Trump the front runner. So it all depends, you know, as a jab, as a retort, I think it can be very effective. But she has to constantly bring it back to, look, you know, figuring out how to do a dig and bringing it back to you. He wants to make it about him. I'm going to make it about you. It's not hard to do that, but there are certain things that can get under his skin. A big one is reminding him that he was fired by the American people, right? How does, you know, I think it's an important moment, frankly, for him to deal with. He's never dealt with it. How is he going to change his presidency? But using his language to describe what happened to him, I think is going to be a fascinating moment. I suspect we'll get it, and I'll be curious how he handles it.
Tara, one of the things that you're writing about and have some new reporting on is how the Trump camp is relying on people behind that Never Back Down super PAC, which famously spent a ton of money in Iowa, only to lose the caucus there by 30 points. You write that this is juicing tensions within Trump campaign staff, with one source telling you, you know, it's a model for when President Trump ridiculed, and now here he is bringing on some of that same team. How does that dynamic affect what's happening behind the scenes on the Trump camp?
Well, they basically took on a PAC that's just started in mid-July. I mean, they just started their ground game, and this is the ground game that they're outsourcing. They're not really doing a lot of the ground game themselves, and it's something new and revolutionary. The FEC just ruled that campaigns can coordinate with PACs in ways they couldn't before, and they're choosing a PAC that was so unsuccessful to coordinate with, and I think it's just shocking. A lot of campaign aides that they would do that they would work with the Never Back Down crew, which, you know, spent $6,700 per vote in Iowa only to lose by 30 points.
To get smoked, right.
Exactly. And they all hate Ron DeSantis and his team. It's a long feud between them. So, you know, it's just causing tensions and all the stuff you would expect from a Trump team.
Sarah Palmieri, thank you, Chuck Todd. We'll be talking more tonight. Thank you both very much for being with us. That's a wrap for this hour, but we've got a lot more coverage picking up right now. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and tonight we are going to see what may be the most critical moment of this 2024 presidential race, and the most critical moment yet, that first debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. Want to show you a live shot now. This is the spin room at Philadelphia's National Constitution Center, where backers of both candidates are going to come out before, they're going to come out after to say, hey, my person won. That's what we always see in these spin rooms. The actual venue, that is in a different location in Philadelphia, and that is where all the drama will be, with big questions about how the vice president and how the former president will try to define themselves and each other in front of a TV audience that could hit, I don't know, 50 million, if June is any example. New polling shows this race in a virtual dead heat. It is a jump ball. It is basically deadlocked. Pick your cliche, but the race, it is real close. And 3 in 10 Americans say what happens tonight could help them make a decision on Election Day. I want to bring in our team of reporters covering every angle of it, and they will be doing that all night long. We'll get the Trump view from Dasha Burns in just a second, but I want to start with the perspective from the Harris campaign with Yamiche Alcindor, who is there. Talk about these final hours now before the debate. We just heard President Biden say he gave her some advice, didn't say what the advice was, but that she's feeling calm, cool, and collected. Walk us through what you're hearing from sources.
Well, sources familiar with what Vice President Harris is doing in these last few hours tell me that she did a walkthrough here in Philadelphia, coming to the convention center, looking around to see the space where she's going to be debating former President Donald Trump in just a few hours. But she's really focused on sort of refining her message, making sure that she stays focused both on the idea that she really wants to introduce herself to voters, especially undecided voters who may be looking for specific things on what a Harris administration would look like. That means talking about policy, talking about her middle-class background, talking about the fact that she's a child of immigrants and how her worldview was shaped. But she also wants to get under Donald Trump's skin. She wants to bait him and really make him really lash out at her if possible, and maybe even use derogatory language to really show America what she thinks is a true Donald Trump. And she also thinks that he's going to lie profusely, so she wants to make sure that she gets him to stumble and mumble. But she's also focused on just keeping calm and not getting caught up in the personal attacks, Hallie.
Mish, thank you very much. Dasha Burns, let me go to you now. And Dasha, what's been interesting here, the Trump campaign has long held that he doesn't really do prep. They're like, he does long rallies, he does these interviews, that's enough. That has not been the case this time around. He's done hours of what they're describing as policy sessions, which is its own form of prep, right? Maybe not a microphone, maybe not a mock lectern, maybe not the mock lighting, but it is still preparation nonetheless. Talk us through that dynamic and your late details here on the strategy for Mr. Trump heading into tonight.
Yeah, look, he's long said campaigning is my prep, life is debate prep for me. But the last few days especially, he's been hunkered down at Mar-a-Lago, doing much more extensive prep for hours, going through potential questions. Not mock debates like Harris has been doing, but yeah, he's been focused in and tells our Garrett Haake that he's feeling great. He's happy with how his debate prep has concluded. The thing that his advisors have been pushing him to do across the board is focus more on policy than personal attacks. Try to tie Harris to the Biden administration as much as possible. Try to make the vice president accountable for some of the frustrations that voters are feeling, whether it's about the economy or immigration. The other thing that you're likely to see him try to do here tonight is to remind folks some of what Harris said, some of the positions that she held when she ran for president back in 2020, some views that were farther to the left than what she says she sees herself doing now if she were in the White House, trying to paint her as more liberal than those average down the middle swing voters would like to see. Hallie.
Dasha Burns live for us there in the spin room. Dasha, thank you very much. Let's be clear about what's going to happen tonight. You're going to see 90 minutes, right? Both candidates there on stage. Each will get 2 minutes to answer a question, a 2-minute rebuttal, and then a minute to follow up. Gabe Gutierrez is coming in now. And Gabe, let's be honest about also what's going to happen tonight. People will hear things that are not true. Right. I mean, that is the reality. There are, gigantic fact-checking apparatuses spinning up at organizations that cover the news around the country for a reason here. One of the things that may come up tonight, it also may not, is a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump's running mate has been spreading about migrants in Ohio, something police have debunked, something that has roots essentially in a racist stereotype. Walk us through this dynamic, because even late today, we're starting to hear more about this in the state of Ohio.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. Look, immigration will be a huge issue in this debate, whether or not this specific story comes up. But I will walk you through it. So there's this town in Ohio, Springfield, Ohio. It has a population about 58,000, according to the last census. Well, over the past couple of years, according to the governor, it has seen a huge influx of Haitian immigrants, about 15,000 or so. Now, yesterday, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, he put something on social media that got a lot of attention. If we can put it up there on the screen. He said that reports now show that people have had their pets abducted and eaten by people who should not be in this country. Well, the Springfield police clarified that rather quickly. They put out their own statement saying there have been no credible reports or specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community. That prompted J.D. Vance today to post something else on social media, walking it back a bit. He said, it is possible, of course, that all of these rumors will turn out to be false. Now, Hallie, we just heard from city officials just within the past 2 hours or so, and the mayor says that actual story, it originated in another town entirely. There was a woman who was arrested for animal cruelty, and then over the past couple of months, there has been a lot of talk in city commission meetings about this migrant influx. Just tonight, the governor is saying that he will send more state resources to Springfield and is calling on the federal government to do more, Hallie.
Gabe Gutierrez, thank you very much for that. I want to take you back to Philadelphia now, because the stage is set. We know Florida Congressman, Republican Mike Waltz, is joining us now. He is in the spin room for the former president tonight. Congressman, thanks for being back with us.
Yeah, sure.
So you are obviously a longtime supporter of the former president, a supporter of his policies here. What is it that you are looking for from him tonight on what may be the biggest stage, the highest profile moment of this presidential campaign in all?
Well, I think you're going to see a very clear contrast on what President Trump did for the economy, of course, pre-pandemic and the lockdowns that we had to impose, where every demographic across the board was at record low unemployment, that the border was the most secure that it had been, that in the Middle East, you had Iranian General Soleimani taken off the battlefield, Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, taken off the battlefield, ISIS relatively contained, Iran broke, and literally peace accords being signed on the White House lawn, and a military that was on its road, on the road to rebuilding. So I think you have those policies that were working, the border, the economy, the crime, foreign policy, contrasted with, we'll see which Kamala Harris shows up. Is it Vice President Harris that's going to take credit for Biden-era policies in the last 4 years, whether that's Afghanistan, the Middle East, or record inflation, or is she going to try to look forward? And, I kind of like the nickname California Kamala, where you see progressive policies in place. You see rolling blackouts. You see record high taxes. Tech companies leaving in droves. They lost a member of Congress for the first time in California's history. So many folks are leaving. So I think you're just going to see that policy contrast, and it's going to be bright and clear, and the American people are going to see it for what it is.
Of course, you mentioned Afghanistan. You're a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, former Green Beret, who served in Afghanistan. We saw that long-awaited House Afghanistan report come out just Monday. Was that yesterday? Forgive me, I've lost track of the days. Either way, it is very new. It is very much in the moment here. We've seen Democrats, we've seen the White House condemn it as partisan, as essentially cherry-picked, in the words of the Biden administration here. How much do you anticipate that coming up tonight from former President Trump? You alluded to the fact that you believe he's going to try to lash Kamala Harris to Joe Biden's policies.
Yeah, there's been commentary on the timing of the report, but I would point out we couldn't even start on the investigation until last year. Democrats ran the House in 2021 and 2022 There was no investigation launched. There were no sit-down interviews with those involved. There weren't even a series of hearings. There was nothing, silence. And I think the families, the veterans who sacrificed so much, the nation after 20 years of war, treasure, and blood over in Afghanistan deserved to understand better what went wrong. All those families, those Gold Star families are asking for, that we honored today with the Congressional Gold Medal, is an apology, an acknowledgement from Biden and Harris that things went wrong, that people will be held accountable, and that we'll learn lessons so that this will never happen again. But instead, they haven't gotten so much as a phone call in all of these years. I think that's a real disservice to them and to every veteran involved.
If it comes up tonight, it is very likely that Vice President Harris will point to the fact that this withdrawal was initiated under former President Trump. But we also know that her team has told our team, sources close to her, that there is a sense that she may try to provoke him, essentially, in a way to highlight sort of some of those moments. You've also got this idea of age being a factor in a very different way that it was when we saw that last debate at the end of June with President Biden. Voters very clearly said they had concerns about the president's age and fitness for office. Now it is Donald Trump who is the generationally older candidate on stage. We know that the vice president is looking to position herself as that opportunity to turn the page. So what do you think the former president's going to do to try to combat that perception?
Well, let me just address this notion that President Trump started the withdrawal. That is absolutely accurate, but both President Bush and Obama negotiated with the Taliban. The difference is the deal was conditional. His advisors came to him and said the Taliban have not lived up to 6 of the 7 tenets of the Doha Agreement. And he said, fine, deal's off. He left our base. He left our troops. He left our allies in our embassy. But had he withdrawn them, he would have pulled all of our civilian assets out before the military. Biden and Harris did the opposite. They pulled our military out and left Americans and our allies behind. And on Harris's role, either you were a vice president that was, I guess, just a wallflower and you weren't at the table, or you were at the table weighing in on the policies. Which is it? Okay. It can't be both. You can't cherry pick which Biden policies you like and you're a part of and which you want to run away from. So if we have an environment where she's running away from the Biden record and President Trump is owning his, I think that'll be a good night for the president. And look, I have never been around someone with as much energy and a motor like President Trump has. I don't think anyone can accuse him of being low energy despite the age difference.
Congressman Mike Waltz, thank you very much for being with us live from that Philadelphia spin room. We've been talking about these things that we're watching for tonight. You heard what the congressman is watching for, some of the substantive policy issues here of what both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump may bring up. Of course, the style, too, how they're going to deliver it. Let's bring in somebody who knows a lot about this and about the prep work, and that's Quentin Folks, Principal Deputy Campaign Manager for the Harris-Walz campaign. Thank you so much for being back with us again. I'm sorry I'm not with you there in Philly, but it's good to see you.
You too.
Let me give you an opportunity to respond, and I think you might have heard some of that conversation, correct me if you didn't, but to what we just talked about with Congressman Mike Waltz, of course, a veteran talking about the issue of Afghanistan. How is the vice president prepared to take this on if this is something that comes up tonight?
Look, I think that the vice president and President Biden had the courage to do what they needed to do in order to ending the longest standing war in American history, and that is what they did. Look, the vice president doesn't politicize our men and women in uniform. It's something that's deeply personal to her. And I think that when American voters are paying attention to who Donald Trump is and how Donald Trump talks about the United States military, let me tell you what the vice president has never done. She's never called the men and women in uniform suckers and losers. She has never degraded veterans by saying she preferred ones who weren't captured or weren't injured or riddled with bullets. And the vice president does not have a litany of people, including her economic advisors, her foreign policy advisors, her former vice president, or anybody who's ever worked for her, not her former vice president, but anyone who's ever worked for her, saying that she would be a danger to this nation. Donald Trump has all of those, and that's how Donald Trump refers to our men and women in uniform. So I think that the vice president's record of respect for our men and women in uniform and her handling of foreign policy is intact. I think that Donald Trump is the one who owes the country an explanation for his.
Can you pull back the curtain a bit on her preparations, on the work that she's been doing here? How today has gone, her mindset as she heads in tonight? Give us a sense behind the scenes of what's going down strategically as she's getting ready for this really high-profile moment.
look, I think that she is excited. Look, I mean, we come into this knowing that this is Donald Trump's 7th presidential debate. This will be the vice president's first as the presidential nominee. But she has a vision for this country. And most importantly, she knows that this is about the future of this country. And she is making sure that she is going to be prepared to speak to Americans about her vision for this country. And that includes lowering the price of food and prescription drugs in this country. That includes giving Americans a tax cut, 100 million Americans across the country, lowering the cost of housing by building more affordable homes with private and public partnerships. That is the vice president's vision for this country, and she is going to go up against Trump, who only has a divisive agenda called Project 2025 that he wants to use to take this country back.
You talk about the numbers. This will be the former president's 7th general election debate as a presidential nominee, her first. That is accurate. Are you casting her as the underdog? Is that what you're saying? Is she the underdog here in this debate, do you believe?
Well, look, Donald Trump is a showman, and he's going to get on stage and lie a lot to the American people. The vice president is going to be prepared to speak directly to the American people about her vision. But make no mistake about it, Donald Trump is the ultimate showman. We saw that from his last debate that he did with President Biden. And so we know he's been preparing for this. But as I said, the vice president is going to come prepared. But she's going to win this debate because she knows what this is about. This is about the future of this country and the American people and protecting democracy. And while she's continuing to do that, Donald Trump is going to continue to double down with a dark, extreme, divisive agenda.
So then 2 questions. You mentioned that you believe Donald Trump's going to get up there and lie. Is she going to be fact-checking him? Does she see that as her role?
If she was fact-checking Donald Trump, she would be doing that with every single one of her answers tonight. And unfortunately, she knows that the American people deserve better than that. So she's not going to fact-check every single thing that Donald Trump says, nor should she have to. The moderator should do some of that. But again, we're not here to complain about the rules. The vice president is showing up ready to put in the work and speak to the American people. But again, her focus is going to be the American people and making sure that she gets her point across about how her administration is going to look when she is elected vice president of the United States.
As I'm talking to those in the
president of the United States.
As I'm talking to those in the Trump orbit, one of the things that they bring up is this idea that they will look to not only tie her to Biden administration policies, but to also point out ways in which she shifted from more progressive positions in that crowded 2019-2020 primary to where she stands today, issues on health care, immigration, et cetera. How is she prepared to defend herself from those kinds of attacks on substance from the former president if it goes there?
Well, first of all, I would say that it would be nice if President Trump and Republicans who are running against Vice President Harris realize who they're running against. It is Vice President Harris. She has her own record. She has her own agenda. She is going to be her own president when she is elected, and that is where her focus is going to be. Look, when it comes to the vice president's position, she is going to make those positions clear to the American people, and you can expect Donald Trump and the Republicans to continue to lie about where her focus is, while on a lot of these issues, Donald Trump is directly responsible for why women living in this country don't have reproductive freedom. Donald Trump is directly responsible for having fewer jobs when he left office than when he came in. And the vice president is going to hold Donald Trump accountable. So, again, the vice president is speaking tonight directly to the American people about her vision and her future in the future of this country.
Quentin Fulks, thank you very much for being with us. I'm sure we'll be talking again throughout the course of the next 50-plus days until Election Day. Thank you. So, you heard from now people who back both of these candidates at a moment when the state of play can best be described as super duper close, which is, of course, the technical term. Steve Kornacki knows that. Is that how you describe it too, Steve?
I think so. You're talking about, Hallie, a 2-point race here nationally. This is the average of all the national polls right now, and this has actually tightened up in the last couple of days. You remember there's that New York Times poll that came out yesterday, actually had Donald Trump ahead. So
let me just underscore something you said, because people will look and go, wait a second, that New York Times poll had different numbers, right?
Yes.
This is an aggregate. This is, we put it all into a big machine that's not just your brain, it's an actual model, and then it spits this out, right?
Exactly, because the New York Times poll had Trump ahead by a point. Pew Research, which is another highly respected pollster, they had the race tied yesterday. So there's a number of different polls floating around, and I think one of the best ways to get a sense of the totality of the picture is you average them together and you sort of look at it that way, and that's what it looks like when you do that.
Okay, so get into a little bit what this race looks like in those battleground states, because we know that national vote is fine for like a snapshot of where things stand, but it's going to come down to what happens in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Georgia, and some of those critical places.
That's right. Donald Trump lost the popular vote the last 2 elections, but did win the 2016 election because he had the advantage in the Electoral College. So here we go. 7 core battleground states here. We think the presidency will be decided in these. 6 of these, by the way, were blue states in 2020. Democrats are trying to defend those. The only one that was a red state in 2020, it's right here, North Carolina. Interestingly, just some recent polling there. Again, we're looking at poll averages here. Doesn't get any closer than that, but by 1/10 of 1 point in the polling average right now, you do see Harris there slightly, very slightly above Trump. But the overall picture, Hallie, I mean, you can see, just look at those margins. That's just razor thin in those states. And there's plenty of room. We certainly know this story. There's plenty of room for error in these polls. And I think that was one of the big stories of the last two elections.
So talk me through, Steve, because you've been saying a lot about a lot of things. What's something that you haven't said on television that you think is important for people to know, that you've been thinking about as you get ready for November?
That's a good question. You know, we talk so much about these 7. There's always the question, can one of the campaigns put something else in play that we're not talking about too much? Democrats would like to tell you maybe it's a Florida or a Texas. Republicans would like to tell you Virginia, you know, Maine, something like that. I'm not sure where it's all going to shake out in Florida, but Florida is going to be interesting to me because there's no state in the country where we get, big state, where we get more complete early results on election night. That 7 p.m. hour on the East Coast when we've got fragments everywhere, we're going to have full counties coming in from all across Florida. And even if the state's red, as we're kind of expecting it's going to be, I think if there's a new trend one way or the other, we might see it there.
What's happening with the Latino vote, for example, in some of these critical counties? What can that tell us and extrapolate about some of these other trends? Steve Kornacki, you ready?
I had no choice.
Thank you, friend.
You got
I feel
it.
the same way. Appreciate it. So listen, we talked about some of the big numbers, the big viewing numbers that could happen tonight if you look at where past debates have been. So for Vice President Harris, it could be a critical night in her political career. She's only been the Democratic presidential nominee for about a month. She has not been tested this cycle by primary debates, although she did 4 of them last cycle. So she has this opportunity to tell the country more about what kind of president she would be, who she would be as commander-in-chief. On the flip side of things, you've got former President Trump looking to recover from a summer, at least a late summer period, where he saw his opponent drop out, his lead in the polls, as you just saw from Steve Kornacki, shrink just a bit. This enthusiasm generated by Kamala Harris taking the top of the ticket, and now the race looking a lot like it did in July. Jump ball. I want to bring in now Shira Stein, Washington correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle, and NBC News chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Thank you both for being with us from a place that I know and love, and that's Philadelphia. Andrea, let me start with you, because you know presidential debates. You've seen some of these close races before. Can you talk us through whether tonight feels different to you and why?
There's so little time left. This is the one and only, perhaps, matchup. These two people haven't even met because Donald Trump, you know, breaking all precedent, refused to go to the inaugural because he wasn't recognizing the Biden election. They have never so much as spotted each other, known each other in Congress in any other context. So this is the first time, and he has a record of being very disparaging, dismissive in the last 48 hours of women candidates of her. So that is a big challenge for her. It's to her advantage, according to his people and the Harris people, if he does unleash the vitriol and the personal attacks. But then she has a big opportunity, if he is very well disciplined, to define herself. And the latest polls show that people just don't know what her policies are. She has to walk this tightrope between, you know, sort of observing and respecting the legacy of Joe Biden, not disparaging him, not being disloyal, taking credit for it, but moving on, looking forward, and distinguishing herself. That's going to be hard to do without being rude to Joe Biden. And she hasn't defined what she would do, specific policies. They know more about her because of the DNC, those who saw it. They don't know exactly what she would do on the economy in particular.
Shira, let me turn to you here because you have, you know, sort of, you have followed, have covered Kamala Harris since she was sort of in these local state races in California. She's done debates. She did one in, you know, of course, 2010. There were some interesting moments there where she let her opponent's awkward moment hang when he was asked if he would double dip, for example, take a salary both in his federal job and a different, or his state job and a different job he had. And she said, hey, she let him talk. Happened again in 2016 when her opponent rather awkwardly did like a dab, essentially. She let that moment hang. She has experience on debate stages, on smaller stages, not a national stage here. Talk me through what you're going to be looking for tonight from somebody who has done 4 presidential primary debates, has done 1 vice presidential debate, of course, in the last cycle. What's your sense?
Hallie, basically what I'm going to be looking for tonight is for Harris to make her point on policies, not to get caught up in any attacks that Trump might get on her. And for him, the test is really going to be, does he focus on the lines of attacks that work for him on her, that she's too far of a liberal, that her policies are bad, tying her to what Republicans see as this current administration's failed policies. If both of them manage to do that, they'll both come out looking pretty good. Now, I'm not so sure that he'll manage to stick to that. And when it comes to her, she has managed to get some really good viral moments with some specific one-liners. It's going to be really interesting to see if she manages to get any of those moments in. As I'm sure you've mentioned, the issue of the hot mics is something that her team really fought for, and that could lead to a problem if she's not able to goad him into losing his cool and then shoot off a cute little one-liner like she normally does.
We'll talk about some of the issues, too, here, Shira, because you look at the issue of reproductive rights, and Andrew, I want to ask you about this, too, but a number of voters, especially women in some of these key battleground states, and you know Pennsylvania is one of them, say that abortion is going to be key for them. Second most important issue overall in some polling, more so for women voters than men by a large margin, as we take a look at the gender gap that exists in this race. I think it is the expectation of many people that Kamala Harris is going to try to go on offense on this issue of reproductive rights. What does she need to do on that front, Shira, to make that effective?
She needs to tie him to a lot of the extremist policies. She's been pretty effective. Reproductive rights is one of the issues that she has worked on the longest, is strongest on. And so as long as she's able to tie him to extremist policies, or what she will say is extremist policies when he talks about abortion, in terms of how many weeks you can get an abortion up until, can you access the abortion pill mifepristone, can you access contraceptives, those kinds of issues will be really key for her, and I expect her to largely succeed on that point. I'm also going to be curious to see how much she talks about the care economy. That's something that she's talked a lot about. It's something that polls really well with both Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So I'm looking to see if she brings that up tonight as well.
Okay, so care economy. Andrew, you talked about economy. We talked about reproductive rights. We know housing costs is something that is likely to come up because Kamala Harris has been talking a lot about that too. Immigration as well, from the perspective of former President Trump. His campaign believes that she has weakness here. They see a political liability in her handling of the Northern Triangle, in her role handling some of the root causes of the migrant crisis here. Andrea, how does she prepare against an attack like that?
Well, the best thing she could do, and that is her biggest vulnerability in the polling, and it's immigration, but substantively it's the economy, but substantively it is immigration. Look, the best thing she can do is say that there would have been a border bill from a conservative Oklahoma senator, a bipartisan bill that Donald Trump tanked, and that was a border enforcement bill as well as reforming a lot of the procedures down there and putting a lot more money down at the border. So I think that's the best she can do, that he obstructed the one chance for bipartisan action on immigration.
Andrea Mitchell, Shira Stein, good to see both of you. Thank you very much. Coming up, we're going to have a lot more coverage of this first debate right here on NBC News Now. And by the way, when that debate begins just about 2.5 hours from now, you can watch it exactly how you're watching now, on TV, online, on your phone. It will be right here on NBC News and NBC News Now. We're going to have much more from Philly coming up. But we're also going to take you down south. Why? Because the Gulf Coast, parts of it are under mandatory evacuation orders as a tropical storm is set to hit as a hurricane in the next 24 hours. A story we're also watching closely. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We are getting closer to that big showdown. We're so close, and I'm just like in my notes. I can't stop looking at our Slacks, at my texts, because that is how quickly things are coming in as we are getting closer and closer to debate night in Philadelphia. But you know what else is getting closer and closer? The potential for a massive tropical storm, potentially a hurricane, to make landfall along the Gulf Coast. We want to get a quick check on that because we got some new National Hurricane Center updates just about 90 minutes ago. Bill Cairns, our meteorologist, is joining us now. It's not a hurricane yet, Bill, right? But people in Louisiana are already getting ready. They've got evacuation orders in place in some parts of that state. Talk us through it.
Yeah, and every storm is different because of where the topography of the land that it makes landfall. So let me get into this a little bit. First off, here's the storm surge forecast. Number one thing we typically talk about is storm surge. That's usually the thing that takes the most lives. When a Category 1, what we're expecting, we're not going to have a crazy, huge storm surge. Plus, this isn't beaches. This is swampland. But this area from 5 to 10 feet is of greatest concern. That's going to be just to the right of wherever that center makes landfall, and that looks to be somewhere close to Morgan City. So let's focus in on this. Here's the New Orleans area, and let's zoom in closer. There's water everywhere in southern Louisiana. So here's Morgan City. I mean, look at these rivers and tributaries and, little mini lakes that are in this area. So a lot of southern Louisiana, after Katrina and other massive floods, they invested a ton of money in the levee system to protect all of the communities like Morgan City and Wilson's Landing and Patterson. So they're going to get possibly a 5 to 10 foot storm surge. But the levees have been built up significantly higher over the years because of the numerous floods. The levee in Morgan City is 20 feet. So this storm is not going to flood the city. They don't have to worry about that. This is not an area that's in trouble. But there's other smaller communities that do not have a levee system like that. I just want to show you one, Hallie, up the river here. A lot of small communities like Rickahook. These are the people that have evacuated already that have, don't have the levee systems to protect them. So just something to watch as we go through tomorrow, as we expect this to be a Category 1, maybe a Category 2 hurricane at this time tomorrow, making landfall.
All right, Bill, you know where you're going to be this time tomorrow. Right back with us on the show right here on NBC. Thank you, Bill. Let's take you back to Philadelphia now, because we are getting closer and closer to a debate that could potentially be a factor for at least some voters in 7 key battleground states. With this race, do I need to say it again? It is close, folks. One of those states is Michigan, where polls show VP Harris leading former President Trump by just a percentage point, but that is well inside the margin of error. Shaq Brewster is in Grand Rapids for us tonight, and I'm super curious, Shaq, when you're talking with people out there, are they planning to watch? Do they care? Have they decided on a candidate yet? Walk me through it.
Yeah, Hallie, I was actually surprised to hear the amount of voters who told me that they do plan on watching it, or at least catching up with the highlights afterwards or when you get to tomorrow. And that's especially the case among those undecided voters, or at least people who are torn, struggling to make that decision. This county specifically is one where you saw Donald Trump win it in 2016, but President Biden flipped it in 2020. It's been trending toward the Democrats. So I went to a farmer's market earlier today and just asked people, are you planning to watch the debate, and what do you want to hear? Here's some of those conversations. Sounds like you're leaning towards supporting the vice president. What are those issues that you want to hear her emphasize?
I want to hear about health care. I want to hear about the economy. And just that she's going to bring a broad perspective.
I just want to know what each candidate has to say for themselves.
You voted for Trump in the past, but it sounds like Vice President Harris has the ability to win your vote tonight.
Yeah, I want to feel like she would be a good leader.
There was a pattern that I found in my conversations. No matter who they said they were supporting, a lot of eyes are on the vice president. They want to hear more from her, even if they like her, and that's why they want to hear more from her. For Donald Trump, a lot of it, even among his strongest supporters, is they just want him to behave, essentially. They want to see a civil debate, and we'll see if we get that later this evening, Hallie.
Did anything surprise you, Shaq? Or let me say, what surprised you the most from what you heard from people today? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think the one thing that surprised me the most is the fact that you have people who are undecided still. And, it makes sense because things have changed up here a little bit when you look at the top of the ticket. But it changes what they're undecided about. Many people said that it's not just, the economy. It's also about temperament. They want to hear more, and it varies in how they get their information. And it's not clear that this debate will be the ultimate factor that changes it. But it's really the talk afterwards that could really make a difference.
Shaq Brewster. Shaq, we're glad to see you. Thank you out there amongst the people. More to come from you, I know. When we come back, more to come from us as well. 2 people who know these candidates well, telling us what they think about the strategy tonight and what they're hearing behind the scenes. That's next. Former President Donald Trump is now on the ground in Philadelphia. There's his plane coming in for a landing, as we're just 2.5 hours away from that debate with Vice President Harris. And that is, of course, where we are in our live coverage tonight in the great city of Philadelphia, in the critical battleground of Pennsylvania. Let me bring in a couple of folks who know these candidates well. Former President Trump's 2020 campaign director of communications, Mark Lotter, and the vice president's former chief spokesperson, Simone Sanders Townsend, also the host of The Weekend on MSNBC. And Simone, you're with me in New York. Let me go to you first. Mark, we'll get to you in a second. But Simone, talk me through some of the VP's biggest challenges, because one of them seems to be people want to know more about her, right? You're looking at this new poll out today saying, or out this weekend, that about 3 in 10 Americans say they need to learn more about who she is. There's this new op-ed out just tonight from former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who says not voting for Donald Trump, who says, I'll be honest, I don't have much of an opinion of Vice President Harris yet because I don't know her well. He says, if she's an unknown quantity to me, you can bet she's one to countless Americans. What does she need to do?
Well, first of all, for the elected official, and I love Chris Christie, that's my bestie. It is for folks like Chris Christie not to know who say he doesn't know a lot about her.
He knows her name.
He knows her name, right, but not a lot about her. That goes to how I think Claire McCaskill has described it as how a number of people within the Beltway and outside underestimated the vice president. I think that some people were actually quite dismissive of her, and now that she is at the top of the ticket and literally could be the difference between not just winning the presidency, but for folks winning back, Democrats winning back keeping the Senate and winning back the House, it's like, oh, well, maybe I should learn more about, maybe there's something here. Obviously, there's something there. Look, what is happening in the polls is what people are saying out there, real regular folk, okay, are saying out there. The people that are talking to Shaq Brewster. And when they say, oh, I want to know more about her, what they're saying is, I want to understand her values. People, yes, they feel like they know who Donald Trump is, so much so that they declined to reelect him in every election that he has been on the ballot in since he won in 2016. So part of what she needs to do is tonight is remind voters of that you know who Donald Trump is, and you know what he comes with. And when people remember that, they're like, oh, yeah, actually, some people who don't like that, they're like, okay, I need to vote against him. But then she needs to also talk about herself, not just, that she was a prosecutor, she took on the cartels. Yes, she has to weave in her professional bio, but her personal bio as well.
Okay, so I talked to one Democratic strategist tonight who said to me, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically, maybe it's not that deep. That maybe people are turning on and they're going to make this binary decision.
No.
Should she be a commander-in-chief or not?
Let me tell you, these people who are sitting in the strategist seats, you have to talk to real regular people. They care about the policy. When I'm talking out there talking to voters, they care about the policy for sure. But they also they say, I don't really know much about her. And when that is translated to, I don't know who she is. What are her values? Like Donald Trump is attacking her, saying she's not really black. He is saying all these things about her. What are her values? I understand that she is an accomplished elected official. I understand that she's, strong.
The vice president of the United States.
Yes, I understand she's a vice president, but I want to know about her. So when she talks about her record and juxtaposes herself between Donald Trump, she also has to talk about her middle-class upbringing. Talk about she took on the big banks because she watched her mom buy her first house, and she thought of her mother in that moment when she was faced with what to do for the homeowners in California.
So then, Mark, all of this said, what do you believe, as somebody who knows Donald Trump well, as somebody who has obviously been in the orbit of debate prep previously, what is former President Trump's biggest liability, his biggest weakness tonight, in your view?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that he needs to make sure that he also defines Kamala Harris. If there's 1/4 of the people out there who say they don't know enough about her, then they need to know about some of her radical positions, like decriminalizing illegal immigration, decriminalizing drugs, defund the police. She's even out there this weekend. We're finding out about a 2019 survey where she talked about taxpayer-funded transition surgeries for inmates and for illegal immigrants. So a lot of these radical positions that she has taken in the past, he needs to take the opportunity to press her on. And then if she tries to walk back, well, I thought you said your values haven't changed. And then on the second side of it, he needs to remind people at home, none of the rest of this stuff matters. Gas and groceries cost more. The border's wide open. Kamala was the tie-breaking vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan. They opened the border. She was the border czar. Things were cheaper. Things were safer when he was in the White House.
Okay, well, let me ask you a couple of things, because you talk about political liability here, what a political weakness is. You've said a lot about Vice President Harris here. I have to ask you about reproductive rights, because this is an issue that is on the ballot potentially in, 10, 12 states coming up in November. And you look at a place like Missouri, where former President Trump has more than half the voters there want to see former President Trump win in that state. And yet, with a ballot initiative there that is going to be on the ballot as of a court ruling today, more than half of the voters want to see protections reinstated for reproductive rights. And I use that example because I think it illustrates the challenge that Donald Trump has here between where most of America is and where some in the base of his party are. How does he handle that tonight? And do you see that as a vulnerability as well?
Well, I think he can turn it into an asset if he leans into the fact that this is democracy. He has said that he thought some states went too far and that the voters, either through ballot initiatives or their state elected officials, would have to find some common ground, some middle ground, and we're seeing that play out. And so that, I think, is the thing that he can actually say. For decades, lawyers on both sides of the aisle, including the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, thought the law, even though she supported the policy, thought that Roe was decided incorrectly on the law. This lets lawmakers, legislators make these decisions. Let the voters have their say. Donald Trump has said where he thinks things are too far and where things are not far enough. And the voters are doing that right now as well.
Yeah, I think this is a good example of what Vice President Harris is going to have to do tonight on the stage. Some of the things that Donald Trump will say, you can't respond to every single thing. She cannot fact check him and walk him down on everything. But on this, he has said, well, I think some of the states went too far. Which ones? You say you don't support Project 2025. What parts of Project 2025 don't you support? Do you not support abolishing the Department of Education? Do you not support changing it to the Department of Life? Do you not support? Like, she has to go down the list, because I do think that the former president has gotten away with these broad statements that are not anchored to any of the facts, if you will.
Simone Sanders, Mark Lauder, thank you both very much. This is only the beginning of our many conversations throughout the evening, because we're going to have a lot of coverage tonight of that first debate between the vice president and the former president, including how they plan to address the top issue for voters, and that's the economy. Stay with us. So here we are, just about, looking at my clock, 2 hours and change away from the start of that first presidential debate in this era of this presidential campaign between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I think we just had a live shot. We'll see if we have it up, of the former president landing in the great city of Philadelphia. You see it there. That's the door open. I'm asking my control room, have we seen him walk out yet, or we're still waiting? I think we're still waiting for him to walk out. We'll see if he walks over to the cameras. We'll see if he says anything. We'll see what he does. He is now just getting to Pennsylvania for the first time here in this sort of run up to the debate. Vice President Harris has been here for a number of days out west in Pittsburgh. That's where she hunkered down to prep. Both of them obviously doing these policy sessions, doing these debate prep sessions that look a little bit different because of their different styles, because of the way that they are both handling these things. But you know, one issue has probably come up for both of them again and again, and that is the economy. You know why? Because it comes up for voters again and again. They care. This matters to them. They want to see their money, obviously, front and center here. You can see some of the numbers here. The most important issue in deciding your vote, the economy here, far and away by double digits. Mark Short is a political advisor, the former chief of staff to former Vice President Mike Pence. Mark, thank you for joining us. Before we get to the economy, Mike Pence was the last person to debate Kamala Harris. How did you prep for that?
Well, Mike's pretty meticulous in this, and so we did 3 90-minute sessions that were not interrupted with, stand-ins playing the role of Kamala Harris. And I think he's very much deep into the policy, and I think that full preparation prepared him well.
We're 4 years past that now. What made him nervous? What made you nervous about going up against, of course, then Senator Harris?
Well, look.
Be honest. Be real. We're well past it. You can tell me that. You can tell me the real deal.
I think that she's obviously an experienced prosecutor. I think you'd seen it as a senator. She'd had plenty of hearings where she put witnesses in difficult positions. But I think also, Hallie, the reality is I think debating minority female, there's always going to be the position I think she wanted of being able to say, hey, I'm talking now, which I think presents a challenge. So I think that optic of how far can you go in being critical of her, I think, was a question, too.
Do you believe, given your time in and around the White House, that former President Trump is grappling with some of those same issues?
I would imagine so, yeah. I would think so.
Okay. I want to look at here who's coming off the plane here. And forgive me, Mark, we're going to pivot to this for a second. Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Gaetz, we know they've been helping with prep. Their senior advisor, Jason Miller, Boris Epstein coming out here as well. These are the folks that have been around him doing the prep, helping him get ready. They like to sort of say, he does interviews, that's his prep. He's been doing like real policy sessions. What do you make of this?
I think
you know these folks. These are your
I think both sides have kind of built up expectations, right? I mean, you hear the Harris campaign say we've been hunkered down in Pittsburgh all week.
They also cast her as the underdog, saying, hey, this is her first presidential election.
Trump team say, hey, he's taking it more seriously this time. It's been more intensive debate prep. I kind of doubt it, but I think they've both raised expectations for performance tonight.
So what are you looking for tonight? I know the economy is of particular interest to you. Frequent eagle-eyed viewers will notice of NBC News Now that you're often on CNBC talking about this. What are you watching for?
Well, I think if you're actually having a substantive debate on the policy, I think that that Harris has more vulnerabilities because Americans are unhappy with inflation, unhappy with the border situation, and I think Trump can prosecute that. But the question is, will he? He doesn't like going deep on policy either. He prefers to be personal. And so if he actually sticks to the policy, I think that's in his favor, but I question that's really what's going to happen.
So which Donald Trump shows up tonight?
Is there a different one? I mean, what do you mean, which one? There's
well, wait a second. Two things can be, same guy, right? Different flavors, perhaps, because let's talk about that, right? Because at many debates, and I've said that two things can be true. He's meandering, erratic. He's prone to personal insults. He's prone to personal attacks. He also has the ability, as we saw in June, to let an opponent unravel themselves, as President Biden did.
Well, I mean, I think that's a pretty low bar. It would have been pretty foolish. It would have been pretty foolish.
I don't disagree. I'm saying we talk about asymmetrical expectations here.
Look, I think that he is far smarter than people anticipate. I think he can be disciplined, Hallie, but I think he's also an entertainer. And so I think that he doesn't really get deep into the policy. He likes to be more of the entertainer in the room. And I think having no audience probably helps him in that sense, because I think if there is an audience, that's where he could be playing to the audience as opposed to sticking perhaps to policy issues.
Tara Palmieri has joined us as well. And Tara, I want to bring you into the conversation. But before I do, Mark, would you consider yourself a never Trumper now?
No, I would not consider myself a never Trumper. I was proud to serve as administration. I was proud for the things that were accomplished. I do think that the events of...
You going to vote for him?
I think the events of January 6th were tragic, and I think that anybody who puts himself above the Constitution, as conservatives, we should first and foremost believe in the rule of law.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I will ask, as former President Trump walks out now, as he is here in Philadelphia, there he is, suit, red tie, he's getting ready. He is just now 2 hours away from this first presidential debate. Aides, those around him, say he's ready. He told our colleague Garrett Hake this morning that he's feeling good. He's ready to go here as he walks over. We'll see if he comes to the cameras. I ask if you plan to back him because Liz Cheney does not, for example. Dick Cheney does not. You've got this group, this country. We talked to Anthony Scaramucci. We talked to Steph Grisham. I know you're going to maybe roll your eyes on some of this, but they are not backing former President Trump here.
I don't put myself in their camp.
Okay. What do you think about moderate Republicans, conservatives who may have some beef with the way that the former president obviously handled those issues around January 6th, his repeated claims of election fraud, his lies about election fraud?
I think they're up for grabs, especially in Georgia, right? I mean, these are the Republicans that voted for Brian Kemp and don't have interest in voting for Donald Trump. These are most likely the, moderate, college-educated swing voting dads that are possibly up for grabs. If there's any men that there are to win for Donald Trump, that would be the group, and they're probably likely Nikki Haley voters. Mm-hmm. So, an endorsement from Liz Cheney to Kamala Harris, I think that goes a long way for her. As many people as she can get, giving her some sort of credibility from conservative world, I think that helps her because she needs to win swing voters over. She can't be seen as a lefty liberal, and that's what Trump is trying to do right now. And the polls are showing that she's seen as too liberal. So anyone who is conservative bona fides, vouching for her, that's a good thing.
Mr. Trump there pulling off in the motorcade, landing in Philly. He is likely headed to that debate site where he will get ready just 2 hours from now. This is a live shot here on the tarmac in Philly. I can't help but notice a smirk. Would you like to share with the class?
I don't think Liz Cheney's endorsement matters to many people. I agree with Tara that I think that Trump is basically a known commodity, and there's not going to be that many different voters who are undecided on him. I think there's a lot more to gain for Kamala Harris and a lot more to lose for Kamala Harris tonight because she's the one that needs to be defined.
Mark Short. Forgive me, we've blown through all our breaks. The magic of television means we're trying to get Vaughn Hilliard here over to the table and sneak you off in a graceful and elegant manner, which we will, in fact, do.
I can exit gracefully.
Thank you, Mark. As we were looking there at that live shot, let me pull up some of the video, too, from earlier today. Stand by. Hang on. We can do this without you having to be, the whole thing. Chill, man. Okay. We talk about former President Trump. We know he's there. We know that Vice President Harris is there. One of the issues that has come up, Tara, is that over-prepping. We've heard some folks on the Trump side sort of say maybe she's too prepped, et cetera. He likes to be loose, so and so. How do you see that?
I mean, yeah, there's always going to be the concern that any candidate is over-prepped or overcooked. Or it's the whole question is, do they seem inauthentic, right? And that is, you know, you want to seem sincere. You don't want to seem like you showed up with a bunch of notes in your head and you're just reading them off. And
there's like a nexus to TV, right? What do we say every single day when we come in the air? Be a normal person.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's it, right? Like, just be normal. But it's hard to do when you're in front of a big audience.
Absolutely.
For anybody.
This is like the biggest moment of her life. I mean, you could look back at the VP debate, and that was so low stakes compared to this. She was sitting. I mean, even just the nature of it all.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a relaxing pose, and now she's going to be probably in highest heels, which is what I was told from her advisors, because she's 5'4", he's 6'3".
That's interesting.
You know, the optics, just looking at the two of them, you don't want to seem diminutive compared to a man. And that's probably part of the reason why they aren't going to shake hands, even though, as we know, candidates haven't shaken hands since 2016.
That's right. That went away in COVID.
Right. But still, it's just, there's also just the optics to think about. And yeah, you want to seem cool. And if she's going to try to win over voters, she can't seem like she's been rehearsed. She has to seem authentic.
Speaking of normal people, one of my favorite normal people, Vaughn Hilliard, has joined us now here, too. You know, it's interesting. Our colleague John Allen, as Tara's talking about some of these moments, because it is, as you've been saying, it's substance and it's style. Our colleague John Allen wrote about Hillary Clinton's debate prep back in 2016 against former President Trump. Philippe Reines, who is back playing a role in debate prep now, practiced these greetings, going in for like an awkward hug. What if he ignored her completely? I mean, they ran through various scenarios based on John's reporting with his co-author for their book of how that moment would go down. These tone setters could matter for how this debate unfolds.
Right. And if I may, what is unique about Kamala Harris, I covered Trump now and have really day-to-day for the last 2 years. But in 2019, I was actually assigned to covering Kamala Harris day-to-day. And I was going around
because you were the embed. I mean, we were covering the Trump campaign since 2015, Vaughn.
And I covered Democrats for a little portion there, and that was to cover Kamala Harris. Day-to-day, went across Iowa, New Hampshire with her. And the part about Kamala Harris is that she had been preparing to debate Donald Trump ever since 2019. In front of hundreds, thousands of people, she would talk about she would be the one to prosecute the case against Donald Trump on a debate stage. She said that she would go toe-to-toe with him on policy, on what it means to unify America. And everywhere she went, that was her message. And almost every single voter I talked to, they were questioning, you know, she didn't have the biography or the history of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, or Joe Biden. But voter after voter told me that they were interested in her because they thought that she could separate the Democratic Party from Donald Trump as an entity. This is her moment. 5 years later, what she visualized on campaign stage after campaign stage in 2019.
So you're saying she manifested it?
Manifested it. And if she was ready in 2019, I would expect that she'd be ready for this moment in 2020.
Okay, so for both of you, as we get closer to now to the exact 2-hour mark before this debate begins, what is we've been teeing up to this debate for how long? I mean, since they agreed to it, right? What is something that you haven't said on television that you think we should be thinking about? What haven't you written about that's in your notebook that you're going to...
I was thinking about this the other day. So when Kamala Harris had her first, she announced she was running for president, and it was just like such an overwhelming... I mean, the crowd was like overwhelming in California.
When she came out in that first...
Yeah, she had a great showing, right? It was much like the rollout for this campaign. And I remember one of the Trump advisors...
You're talking about in 20... You're talking
19.
About, yeah, okay.
I remember one of Trump's advisors saying to me, oh my God, we're terrified of that woman. Like that would be their worst fear, would be having Donald Trump up against a black woman who is that charismatic and that persuasive. And at that point, she was not, last in the polls. I mean, she was just coming out, and I think she was really, she was really in her moment, and people were giving her a look. And yeah, they were terrified of how he would react to her. And so it's just kind of amazing that I think back to this, and I thought about it this morning, and I was like, let's see how it works out. So is there something to this gut feeling they all have?
And exactly to Tara's point there, this has been a long conversation. How much do you focus on Donald Trump, right? Back in 2019, I know we keep going back in history here, but there was a lot of conversation for Democrats at the time, like how much do you focus on Donald Trump versus focusing on the future and policy and how you can make people's lives better? Kamala Harris was somebody who never shied away from talking about Donald Trump directly, and that played into the Trump advisors' fears at those time of the day that they may have to take her on.
Vaughn Hilliard, Tara Palmieri, we're so glad to have you both. What a great conversation. It's going to be a fascinating night, and we're going to have every minute of it covered right here on NBC News Now. We've got more coverage picking up right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.